inclusive communities. This program sparked our interest in the complex problems of housing and has resulted in the formation of an affordable housing task force under the auspices of our Racial Justice Committee. We are so fortunate to have Molly Metzger come back and talk to us today. Molly has a BA in Women's Studies from Carleton College and a PhD in Human Development and Social Policy from Northwestern. Her research focuses on local, state, and federal housing policies and how these policies often result in patterns of segregation and inequality. Today, she serves as the Senior Policy Advisor to Dr. Sam Page, St. Louis County Executive, in addition to her duties as a Senior Lecturer at the Brown School at Washington University. Her topic is Housing Justice in St. Louis County, Recent Developments and Future Possibilities. So if you have questions as we go along, please ask those questions in the chat function. And at the end of the presentation, Nancy Litz will moderate the chat, and we will, then it will come back to me, and I will talk a little bit about the new Affordable Housing Task Force, which has been formed under the auspices of the Racial Justice Committee. Our first initiative will get underway, or is getting underway as we speak, and we are calling this Hold the Door Open. So Molly, if you will tell us why the door to affordable housing in St. Louis County has been closed for so long and what we can do about it in the future. So Molly, thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Barbara. Thanks so much for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be back with your group. And of course, we're having technical difficulties. I chose the wrong day to do some updates on my computer, so it's not letting me share my screen. Nancy, is it allowing you to share my slides? I'm also going to put a link to my slides in the chat. I'm going to go through a bunch of information pretty quickly, and these are the slides, so thank you, Nancy. Thanks for the quick recovery. Sorry about the technical difficulties. But I did want to point you to the link I put in the chat, which include additional readings and resources if you want to learn more about the information I'll be going through pretty quickly today. I'm going to go, again, pretty quickly through the nature of the problem, the set of problems that we're dealing with in terms of the affordable housing crisis that's affecting our country and specifically St. Louis County, of course. Give some sort of terminology 101, but I really want to focus the time on what I see as one list of places to start in terms of solving the problem that I thought might be of interest to this particular group, and then end with a brief comment on coalition building. If you could go skip the next slide because we don't have the link, and go to the, and actually Nancy, if you could please go to slideshow. And then 2 slides down, please. Okay, so probably news to no one in this group that we have been experiencing a housing crisis in our country and in our county that predated the pandemic. And this housing crisis manifests itself in different and interrelated ways. So of course, we have ongoing problems with housing instability and homelessness. A lot of my work has looked at the intersection of housing and education, and especially in our public schools, and especially in the school districts in North County, we see incredibly high rates of school mobility as a function of this. So kids are bouncing between homes, they might be homeless or they might be housing insecure, couch surfing, doubling up with family members, and then transitioning between schools in the middle of the school year, sometimes multiple times in a school year. So there's this sort of instability that affects low-income people and especially people of color. We have an affordable housing crisis, so people often spending more than a third, more than a half of their income on their housing costs. Housing quality, as much as we know from the public health literature about the effects of lead and other heavy metals, we still haven't solved that problem. And then the eviction crisis, which includes both legal and illegal evictions. Right now, our housing courts are closed in St. Louis City and County. That doesn't mean people aren't being evicted. It's just that they're being evicted illegally. If you could hit down, please, Nancy. So again, this host of problems really affect everyone, directly or indirectly, people from all racial and ethnic backgrounds, all ages, but they disproportionately affect women, children, and especially people of color. And these problems have been worsened by the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic crisis that is part of that fallout. And if we had 2 hours, I would spend 1 hour on the history that got us here. And in my previous talk with your group, Jason Purnell and I really focused there. But it's very important if you're entering this space to get to familiarize yourself with this history. So again, in the slides that I sent you through the chat, you can see some places to start if this history is new to you. But it is really one of an ongoing history of structural racism. And that includes both explicitly racist policies in the since the beginning of our country, and especially in the first half of the 20th century, policies like redlining and restrictive covenants that set rules through federal, state, and local law about who was able to live where. The real estate state is a term used by a sociologist named Sam Stein to discuss sort of the oversized impact of the real estate industry, including the financial side of the industry, on our politics. And then the financialization of real estate. So the fact that real estate is treated like a commodity and is not thought of just as people's homes, but as a commodity that is traded in a very complex way. So these are all, it's a complicated history and it's important history. So again, please check out the links if you want to learn more. Next slide, please. So I wanted to go into some of these key terms to get everyone on the same page. Next slide. So solutions to the housing crisis. It means putting a roof. I mean, it's necessary, but not sufficient to put a stable roof over people's heads, right? And so again, according to sort of a technical definition, the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, oversees a lot of the programs on the federal level that get implemented locally. And the typical definition that they use and that professionals in this field use is that housing is considered affordable when a household pays less than 30% of their income on their housing costs. Here in St. Louis County, we have more than 100,000 households who are not living in affordable housing. So they're considered, again, another technical term here is housing cost burden, meaning that they're spending more than 30% of their income on their housing. And you can see from the map, the darker colors show places where a higher percentage of households are housing cost burdened. So again, you can see that this really is a problem that affects a lot of the county, but also that is disproportionately represented in North County. Next slide, please. So then the big question is, though, if affordability is all based on your income, and we're talking about, well, how do we build or sustain affordable housing? Well, affordable for whom? And that, it really gets complicated quickly, and I'm going to try to give you some of just the 101. In terms of when we talk about affordable housing, who's it affordable for? It really depends on what affordable housing program you're talking about. But in general, the income guidelines are set to target households by income as a percentage of the area median income. So again, this is another key term to familiarize yourself with, AMI. When we talk about this, we're talking about the median income for the entire St. Louis region. So again, HUD updates these numbers every year to look at the census data, the new census estimates, and say, okay, what is the income level at which 50% of households are below that, 50 or above? And they said that again on a regional level. And then next slide, please. housing programs are targeted on the basis of AMI. So extremely low income, again, is a technical category that refers to households at less than 30% of AMI. So in our region, that is approximately $17,000 of income annually for a family of 3. And again, it's complicated, so if you're talking about a larger family, it's a larger number. If it's a single family or a single person in the household, it would be a smaller number. But for a family of 3, this is, it's extremely low income. It's $17,000 a year under the poverty line. Very low income is 50% of AMI, about $28,000 a year for the same size family. And low income is typically refers to 80% of AMI or less. If you could hit down, please, Nancy. So yeah, and one more. So this shows, what different housing programs target. So when we're talking about public housing and housing choice vouchers, or which are commonly known as Section 8 vouchers, these are programs that are administered by local housing authorities. These are the programs that really that target the households that are really most in need, which are households at 30% AMI and lower. So, and you can make slightly above that amount and still without losing your subsidy. But the majority of public housing units and housing choice vouchers are targeted at this kind of lowest end of the income distribution. When we talk about low income housing tax credits, we have, a federal, this is often referred to as LIHTC, L-I-H-T-C. This is a tax incentive that helps to build and rehab housing for the purposes of low income housing. The income guidelines are a little higher. So typically it's actually 50 to 60% of AMI where the rents are set for those units. And then there's a more sort of amorphous term that's often used, which is workforce housing. It's less formally defined, so you can use that term to reference a lot of things, but it typically means people who are in like the ballpark of 80% AMI. Webster Groves, I do a lot of work with Webster Groves. They're currently negotiating a project in the hopes that it will include some workforce housing. And the way that they benchmarked it was, what would a first-year teacher make in our school district? We want to make sure that we're able to include people like them, people in that income category in our community. So it's less technical, but it's a way of sort of reframing this issue. But it's important to note that the greatest need really is at the lowest end, and the likelihood of homelessness is higher for people who are extremely low income. The next slide, please. So as you're entering this advocacy space, especially if you're doing that kind of advocacy where you're working with specific developers, advocating for affordable housing to be included in specific developments, it's very important to be able to speak in detail. So it's not just that we want some affordable housing, because what one person might consider affordable might be very unaffordable to someone else, right? So, and sorry, I'm getting a bunch of notifications. Let me try to turn this off. Sorry if you can hear the dinging from my computer. But so it's important to be able to speak in detail. So are you talking about affordable rental or home ownership? Both are important. Affordable at what specific income level? What percentage of AMI, for instance? What number of bedrooms? So, are you thinking about families or other types of households, people with disabilities? Are you making these units accessible? How many units are you going for? So again, if you are getting into negotiating, advocating for specific asks, it's important to be thinking about these sorts of details. Next slide, please. I know that you are also thinking about how to confront NIMBYism. So NIMBYism, N-I-M-B-Y, not in my backyard. This response that pops up often when conversations about affordable housing start to take hold, people say, oh yeah, this is very important. I just don't want it in my neighborhood, right? So without going into a ton of detail, I just wanted to point you to the Frameworks Institute. They have really helpful research-based resources on messaging, what works and actually what backfires in terms of how you can frame this issue. Next slide, please. So just as a couple examples from some of their publications, they suggest that you position people in stories of places and systems, for instance, local laws that shape communities. So it's important to like humanize this issue, that to show how the housing crisis affects real people in your communities. But it's also important not to get stuck in the story of talking about this as if it's a problem of individuals, right? So it's important that we really do talk about the systemic factors that shape opportunity. Next slide. Another is that we point to community values that prompt stories of us instead of stories of them. Widen the lens from them to us, illustrate how housing impacts everybody in a community, not just those pushed out, but also those who remain. So again, sort of appealing to people's higher values as opposed to shaming or making people, going some other route. So, tapping into the values that you share. All right, so I want to get into some details about what some specific solutions might look like, really kind of concrete next steps that might be appropriate in specific municipalities and within the county at large. I do want to make sure I say as well that my talk today is really with my Washington University hat on, not on with my St. Louis County hat on. So I'm not speaking on behalf of the county executive or anyone else today. These are just my thoughts here. Next slide. So the first solution, and I know that members of your group are interested in this, is creating community benefits agreements. Again, the way that Webster Groves is doing now to some extent, working to make sure that affordable housing is part of new housing projects that are coming into our communities. So a community benefits agreement, or a CBA, is a contract that's signed by community groups and the developer. So whoever is building the housing, rehabbing the housing, putting together all the financing required to do that. Sometimes developers maintain control of the properties after they're built. Sometimes they sell them. Basically, this is a negotiations process between the community and the developer that requires the developer to provide a range of specific community benefits related to the proposed project. And in exchange, the community groups agree to support the project. This is especially relevant, I'd say, if the developer is asking for tax breaks. So TIF or tax abatement or other tax breaks, provide an opportunity for the community to say, if you are, asking for this tax break, this is what we want. And affordable housing, depending on the project, could be part of what the community wants. If it's some other type of development that's not residential, if it's a commercial development, it might be things like we want living wage jobs, we want higher quality jobs, things like that. But if it's housing, you could be talking about specific affordability requirements. In terms of what makes for a strong CBA, and again, there's a group called Equitable St. Louis who has done really great work on this. And they, I link to their sort of best practices document, but you want to make sure that this agreement is a legally binding agreement, that it's not just a handshake agreement. The next sort of bucket of solutions I wanted to talk about are inclusionary zoning. So whereas CBAs typically work on a case-by-case basis, where with each new development, you're having to eke out a new deal, inclusionary zoning are laws that require that all new multi-unit developments set aside some units as affordable housing. We currently don't have this anywhere in St. Louis that I'm aware of, but many other cities have these sorts of requirements. In terms of how affordable, those things can vary. So again, depending on what's happening in the local housing context, You might want to adjust, the percentage of units, the degree of affordability. You could adjust whether it's mandatory for all developments or only for developments that are requesting some kind of tax break, some kind of incentive. And then of course I have a typo on this slide, but what this should say is that laws may or may not allow for the developer to pay into a fund that would provide for affordable housing elsewhere. So the developer might say, we think affordable housing is important. This is a relatively small development. We don't really think it would fit into this development. We would prefer to just pay into a fund where that could help build affordable housing elsewhere. So again, your community could decide whether or not you would allow that kind of option for the developer. But again, this would, instead of being, a case-by-case negotiation, these would be laws that would set requirements that all developers would have to play by. Next slide, please. The third type of solution that I wanted to shine a light on is the idea of the community land trust. Some students of mine partnered with Webster Groves last semester and put together a great video that's too long for our period of time today to show you. It's about 10 minutes long, but you can check this out in the link to see what we've been doing. Webster Groves is in the very earliest stages of establishing a CLT. But the way that this model works is that a community group maintains control of certain properties. They maintain control of the land, and then the housing that is built or rehabbed on that land is sold to typically low to moderate income homeowners at a reduced price. And this is has been especially successful in areas that are gentrifying or where home values are going up. Basically, when that property is then sold, so the homeowner might live there for however many years, 5, 10, 15, 20 years. When they sell the home, the sales price is capped. So they can still make money off of their investment, but the idea is that this would help first-time homeowners build equity, but it would also help to preserve a long-term stock of affordable housing in communities where it's hard to find. There are all different ways. There's a lot of flexibility in this model. So it's typically used for home ownership. It can be used for rental. It's an idea that is, I think, getting sort of renewed attention in St. Louis. There's a new CLT in South City called Art Place that's just getting going. They're also developing a CLT in North St. Louis with the Green City Coalition. So it's a really exciting model. It has a lot of potential. The devil's always in the details, but this is, again, another way that certain communities could go if there are still properties. Again, if a place is already so built out that there are no properties that would fit into the CLT, then it's probably too late for this model. But where there are still some viable lots or sort of modest homes that could be bought by the trust, that can be a really successful model. Next slide, please. The last issue I wanted to point to, and then we'll turn to Q&A pretty soon, is the growth of the Affordable Housing Trust Fund in St. Louis County. So a lot of the affordable housing that we provide relies on federal funds, and it's just not enough. Public housing revenue has been on its way down for years, over multiple administrations. Housing choice vouchers reach a small percentage of people who are eligible for them. So even though those federal sources of funding seem to be moving in a better direction at the moment, it's really important that we also have local sources dedicated, because we can't, unfortunately, we just can't rely on the federal level to cover the need. So we have an affordable housing trust fund in St. Louis City. It is funded by a use tax, which is a kind of unusual tax that businesses pay on out-of-state purchases. So that funds, it's around $5 million a year that is layered into affordable housing projects. So typically they will receive some other kind of subsidy. And then the city's affordable housing trust fund will kind of help make the project work. It can also be used to fund services that accompany affordable housing or homeless services, shelters, and things like that. So it's not just for the bricks and mortar, but it's also for, it can be for like a sort of a service component. In St. Louis County, we have established an affordable housing trust fund, but it's brand new. We don't have any money in it yet. Our initial source of funding is the sales tax, is a portion of the sales tax on medical marijuana. So as these dispensaries open in St. Louis County, this will start to seed the fund, but we don't expect that it'll be very much in the first couple of years. So we're looking for ways to grow that fund. And again, one of those could be sort of similar to the city's model of using a use tax. So this is the kind of thing that we would, that again, with my WashU hat on, not with my county hat on, but would ask you to talk to your county council members about. There's also state legislation that could help us build out the amount of money being collected through the use tax. And I could go into more detail about that if people are interested in the Q&A. Nancy, if you could go, I think I have just 2 more slides at the end about partners, good partners in terms of coalition building.
Sorry, Molly, I'm not ignoring you. My computer's being cranky.
No, it's just bad timing today. So I actually, we can turn off the slides. I think I remember what's on these last slides. So in terms of how I came to this list of really what our recommendations, I don't see this as the end game for solving the affordable housing crisis. These 4 ideas, I think, are ways to move in the right direction. I think good solutions do 2 things. They make a dent in the problem. So they actually help people in tangible ways, immediately. But 2, they help to build power. They help to build a coalition toward the bigger wins, right? And so those are the sorts of the 2 broad goals that I'm thinking about when I think about what a policy agenda might look like. And in terms of, and I'm so thrilled that this group is taking up this issue, and I think we need it. we need help. We need support. And there are some existing groups that would be, I think, smart to partner with. One that's at the top of my list personally is the Community Builders Network. They have an affordable housing trust fund coalition that's been really effective at sort of protecting and growing the trust fund in the city and establishing our new fund in the county. They also have an affordable housing report card that will be coming out later this year. They hired a really smart woman named Christina Garmendia to look at housing data and do a lot of outreach around these issues in St. Louis City and County. So in terms of if you're interested in what the data look like in your specific municipality or more recent trends, I think that report card will be really instructive and will be helping to set some goals around affordable housing production. And then I guess the last thing I wanted to say around partnerships, I'm also curious to hear, I'm sure there's a lot going on in St. Louis County that I'm not aware of, so I'm always have my ears open for who's working on this issue. But like I mentioned, I've been doing a lot of work with Webster Groves. I think they have a lot of progress to learn from. They've expanded their fair housing protections for Section 8 renters. They're, again, working on this new community land trust. And there are a number of groups, the North Webster Neighborhood Coalition, the Alliance for Interracial Dignity, and I think more recently, the League of Women Voters, the Kirkwood and Webster branch are interested in taking this issue up as well, that it could be good to talk to and maybe learn from. And with that, I wanted to open it up for Q&A. I haven't kept my eye on the chat. I know there's been a lot in there, but with that, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So Molly, if you want me to sort of cue you from what's in the chat, some of the questions were sort of specific, and I feel like you circled back to those. But Laura Horowitz was asking about the political framing of workforce housing and the potential downsides of using that terminology specifically around the implication that really poor people just aren't trying and aren't worthy of help, and some of that psychology.
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with that. And I think the idea with workforce housing is that I think it plays into these notions of like deserving and undeserving poor, like big quotation marks, and that you should be working, you know, to deserve a roof above your head, you should be working. And many of us aren't working for all kinds of good reasons, or want to be working and aren't, you know. So I hear you loud and clear. You know, I think that the use of that term is probably intended to try to get ahead of the NIMBYism, you know, the knee-jerk reactions. But again, I think, you know, the Frameworks Institute and all the research on that would say that in the long run, that kind of framing is actually going to fail because it reinforces a story that this housing crisis is the result of people's bad decisions, and it's just not true. And I think, you know, people need to understand how we got here, and if we were more honest about that, then I think there would be more broader support for these sorts of solutions. So just, I guess, an amen to that comment.
So spinning off that answer, I was recently part of coordinating a presentation for the congregation that I belong to, with Dr. Colin Gordon, who wrote Mapping Decline. And it was so, I mean, because I'm part of Women's Voices, and like probably everyone else on this call, I've been looking at this issue for a while. It was so sort of such a stark reminder how many people were going, oh my gosh, I had no idea. This is terrible. I had no idea. What, obviously, short of having you give up your life entirely and do nothing but do presentations, what other resources are there to help us share this information with the broader community to hopefully facilitate some of that recognition that people in difficult circumstances, you know, aren't just lazy and no good and whatever, that those situations were created?
Yeah, well, I mean, I will say that I am happy to talk with other groups as well. So it doesn't hurt to ask me. I'm due to have a baby at the end of May, so I will have limited availability after that. That's probably why you hear me out of breath. I'm like, my lungs are being compressed right now, but I'm happy to talk to lots of groups. And again, Christina Garmendia also will be a great resource once this affordable housing report card comes out. You're welcome to use my materials. Nancy, you have my slides, but you're happy to adapt those. You're welcome to adapt those. And then I would say I'd also be happy to do sort of like a train the trainer kind of thing. So if there was a critical mass of people in this group, or maybe from other groups that I mentioned that were interested in leading the conversation, I'd be happy to work with a group like that to kind of create an outreach team.
Actually,
do a book club. Mm-hmm.
The idea of a train the trainer, I think, is really exciting and something that we could certainly look into within our group and within those coalitions. So that's sort of amazing. Several other people were asking what we can learn from what's going on in Webster. And I'd like to expand that to ask about also what other municipalities around the country are having success with this kind of work that we might be able to learn from.
So Laura Arnold, I did see that you put something in the chat. Laura, would you like to take a minute of my time, or I don't want to put you on the spot though? And if she's not able to unmute, or, and I'm sorry, please remind me of the specific question about,
what we could learn from the efforts in Webster Groves and how that might potentially be replicatable, if that's a word, and if there are other lessons around the country.
Yeah, so I think that, so I'll speak, and then Laura, if you want to chime in too, please do. Laura Arnold, for those who don't know, is a city councilwoman in Webster Groves, who's really been at the helm of this. So I think Webster Groves has a couple of things going for it. One is that it has active and organized multiple community groups and churches who care. And it has elected officials who care. And those two groups are in constant communication. And so they have this great, sometimes you talk about it as like inside outside strategy, like the community groups can be more public facing and to help to rally support, because there will always, the farther along things get, there will always be NIMBYism. I haven't really seen it in Webster yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if it did emerge at some point. But they really have a critical mass of support from a lot of different backgrounds, not just racial and ethnic, but also age. Because again, part of this issue too is that, of the affordable housing issue, people who are interested in aging in place, but don't necessarily want to stay in their home, they might not be able to stay in the town that they have been raising their kids in, because there are no apartments, there are no more like places that would be sort of appropriate for their next stage of life. So, so I think, and Laura, I see you now with your video on. Is there anything you'd like to add in terms of how you've been able to set the stage for all this?
No, I think you're doing an excellent job as usual, Molly. Thank you. I think the really important thing is that you mentioned that they're the two sides, right? You need elected officials who want to work on this, but equally importantly, if not more importantly, you need people in the public who are holding those of us who are elected accountable for doing the work. And when we are talking to one another is when you can do things. The second thing I would say is we all want this to be solved tomorrow. And this is a huge uphill climb that you have to all the time in your community celebrate the smaller victories. Even when you feel like we've had a meeting and a lot of people showed up, that's a victory. And so that would be the other thing I would add, is just that as communities work on this, it's a daunting task. So make sure you're acknowledging the progress you made, even if it's not necessarily changing the law per se. And I will say, even though you've said nice things about Webster Groves, we have a really long way to go. And so we have lots of work to continue to do as well. And so I did put my email address in the chat if anyone's interested, getting on our email mailing list about the land trust in Webster Groves, or if you have questions about other stuff, feel free to reach out. But I'm not going to take any more of Molly's time because she knows way more than I do.
Well, thanks, Laura. And one more thing I wanted to say that I think was really wise in Webster was that, and again, correct me if I'm getting any details wrong, but that when you start, before you passed source of income protections, these are the, fair housing protections for housing choice voucher renters, or did any of the other things that you've done. I remember you passed a resolution at the city council or maybe it was part of your sort of strategic plan, a visionary document, where you laid out the issue and kind of did some level setting to, again, sort of build the support from the usual suspects, and maybe not always the usual suspects, but to kind of get some shared language going and to sort of establish it as a joint goal. And I think that was really wise. So again, I think there's a lot to learn from Webster. Nancy, who was the last question? There was a second part to the question.
Oh, just in other cities, what's being done? I know I've heard some things about the Minneapolis-St. Paul area passing some requirements about new housing as it's being built, and how did they manage that?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things they did in Minneapolis was, and this is also something that's being discussed in Webster Groves, is to change zoning law to make it easier to build multifamily housing. So typically the way that zoning laws dictate what is able to be built where. So is an area zoned for residential development or commercial development or industrial development? And then where it's residential, is it, large lot, single family homes, McMansions, or can you build affordable housing or something or multifamily housing or anything in between? And typically you if you're in a place that would allow multifamily, you can always build single family, but the reverse is not true, right? And so what Minneapolis did was make like the family or the multifamily zoning level the kind of the most inclusive, that if it like basically anywhere in Minneapolis, if the lot's big enough, you can build multiple units on it. That in and of itself doesn't mean that anyone will, right? So there's still the question of if it's going to be affordable, how are you going to fund it? Where's the money going to come from? So I think it's not a bad thing, but I think that it runs the risk of being sort of a token sort of solution, unless you're putting real resources into what you're building in those spaces. So that's what I'll say about Minneapolis. I think there's a lot to learn from Kansas City, especially because Kansas City, Missouri is dealing with our same state regulatory environment. So they've had a lot of success on, in terms of tax incentive reform and a number of other issues. So I'll leave it at that. But I think that they're definitely someone to learn from. Columbia, Missouri also has a community land trust that's been, small but successful. That has been run by their city government, and it's also, I think, a model to learn from.
An awful lot of what's showing up in the chat now is our participants suggesting additional resources. One other question that comes to my mind is that periodically you hear some big buzz about the tiny house model as a partial solution or potential solution. Anything to say about that?
So I think, again, I talked about, the different types of housing programs target different income levels. Tiny houses are typically targeted to people who are unhoused, who are really at the lowest end of the income distribution, and who need a safe place to spend the night, and who might not be interested in shelter care or shelters, especially during the pandemic. Our capacity is limited because of the need to socially distance, and not everyone wants to enter shelter care. So tiny houses are again sort of a creative way to help keep people safe. The city has recently built a small tiny house, I don't know what you would call it, community development just off of Jefferson. So, again, there is a whole range of problems when it comes to housing. Tiny houses, I think, are part of the solution when it comes to people who are currently unhoused.
Should mention that I've seen several congratulations on your pending new edition, and people saying, gosh, you can tell. So for what that then another sort of series of related questions. What are suggestions for convincing predominantly white communities to support or at least not block affordable housing? And then I wonder if there is a way to use the common interest in and need for affordable housing in redistricting a community of interest. Your thoughts?
Okay, I'm always bad at holding two questions at the same time, so I'll probably need you to remind me of the second part, because I was thinking of my answer to the first part. I think do check out the Frameworks Institute. I mean, there are probably, in terms of folks who would oppose affordable housing, there are those who might be movable and those who might not be movable. But I think, to use best practices in terms of messaging, to appeal to people's higher values, that's a good place to start. To tell the story of how we got here, to confront the narrative that this is all about people making bad decisions on, an individual level, or that this is just about private decisions, that this isn't about government. We need to just really tell the story of how we got here. And so that's my 2 cents, especially for like the white people in the room, which there are a lot of. I mean, I think, I have definitely spent a lot of time trying to talk to my own family members about these issues and tell the stories as I've come to understand them, with some success and some failure, but I think you need to try. And then I think, and I spend more of my time, I do try, but I spend more of my time talking to groups like this where you have general support, but, maybe questions about, well, what's the next step, right? And so it's not about converting people to your side. It's also, helping to mobilize people who are already on your side. And then what was the second question? Sorry.
Nancy Price said, I wonder if there's a way to use the common interest in and need for affordable housing in redistricting a community that you're focused on, which I think is, and as I understand it, is sort of related to the previous question, but with a little different nuance.
I'm not sure I understand. Redistricting?
Nancy, are you on? Do you want to unmute and
I'm not sure if you're talking about.
about that?
I think my thoughts go in a couple of different directions, like the city's ward boundaries, and then I'm not sure what kind of redistricting.
Actually, I was thinking more of in the county, although, the city's doing more stuff right now. But as a follow-up to the census, we have to redistrict. And one of the things that's been proposed is to try and define communities of interest, and they can have different things in common. But, the one that comes to my mind is always like the Bridgeton landfill, which is not necessarily within certain city lines or whatever, but everybody that lives around that has a common interest. And so you might want to draw a new district that does not split that group because they have a common interest. And I'm trying to think how we can get a critical mass of like-minded people in one spot so this could move forward. But I don't really, I haven't thought it through.
And I don't know enough about the process to really be able to weigh in on it. Though I'm just with you in general in terms of the importance of not splitting cohesive communities. And I think that's just part of best practices, but that's often ignored or intentionally ignored, splitting Black political power, for instance, or other, in other cities, you look at how lines are drawn right through immigrant communities. So I think that's obviously really important, but beyond that, I don't know if I have any suggestions.
Barbara, I know you wanted a few minutes to talk about what the Women's Voices Task Force is up to. We have about 5. Is this the point at which you'd like for me to share that slide and switch back to you?
Yes, please share the slide, and it won't take me 5 minutes.
Okay.
So as a result of the earlier presentation by Molly Metzger and Dr. Jason Purnell, and the fact that we are watching what is happening about housing in our community, our Racial Justice Committee decided to form a task force that would work on affordable housing. And our first initiative, and heaven only knows how many we'll have, I'm sure, hope that it will outlast me, but to get us started, we are calling on our members and where they live to help us. And we have titled this initiative, Hold the Door Open. Women's Voices members are, by and large, not developers or financiers or anything that could really make a dent in this problem. But most of us live in communities that are considered communities of opportunity. We live in the central corridor, in the suburbs. We have good schools. We have access to shopping and groceries. We have access to transportation. This makes our communities desirable. And this is where we think we need to start talking. And several people have asked me, well, what can we do? And the only thing that I can say is what we teach our children when they are young. Use your words. We need to be able to band together our members in our communities, find out what is going on in terms of housing or what is not going on, and then raise awareness among the people who are the decision makers about the need to tackle this problem. Webster Groves has done an incredible job of opening the door a little crack. And I think that other communities can follow that, can do their own kind of opening, but we need to be able to get together and talk about it and to raise awareness about it. So we're working on a brochure, and this will be the cover of the brochure, Hold the Door Open. And the brochure is not going to be specific at all. It's going to be more what I consider to be a moral document about the need for us to tackle this program now. When it comes to specifics, we can always and we will develop materials that relate to a specific project or a specific concern in a specific community. But to get us started, we need this umbrella document that lets people know who we are and what we want and why. So that's what we're working on. We invite all of you to join us. If you're interested in this, just send an email to racialjustice@womensvoicesraised.org. We'll put you on a committee. We'll put you on the list. We'll find something for you to do for sure. So with that, I'm going to close. I want to thank Molly Metzger. Molly, you are such a generous presenter, and you have so much information, and you manage to give it to us in a way that we can understand and that makes us realize that our approach to this has to be confronting our own prejudices, our own friends and relatives' prejudices in a non-judgmental way. That is going to be a hard job. So we welcome all of you to join us. Thank you for spending this hour with us. We are thrilled to have you, and I hope you have a wonderful sunny afternoon. Thank you, everybody.